One of the criticisms of the idea of open society, one of the criticisms of liberal society, one of the criticisms of liberal democratic society, made from people of faith, has always been the claim that secular reason, science, secular public claims are privileged in liberal society, and religious voices, religious claims are excluded. And so an open society is not as open as it claims to be, because it basically says you can come in and join the public debate provided you speak our language, the language of secular claims and secular science and secular reason. The one thing I would say about open society, if you look at its history, is that the very idea of an open society, a liberal democracy, has been forged, has been created, has emerged historically precisely at this point. Precisely at the point of what is the place of faith in a democratic society? What is the place of religious conviction in a free society? How do we create a free society in which people can disagree about God, disagree about faith, but have an argument together about what a democratic society should do? When you think about the history of liberal freedom going back to the Reformation and moving forward, this is a history in which, for secular thinkers or for thinkers of any kind, the problem is, how do we maintain a democratic order among Protestants and Catholics who disagree about ultimate questions of faith? How do we maintain a political order when we have Protestants, we have Catholics, we have Muslims and unbelievers, and we have atheists in the middle? How do we maintain a public discussion that avoids civil war, that avoids conflict, and finds a way in which we can come to democratic agreement despite deep creedal political differences? So when you think about open society and you think about its history, religion is at the center of the story. I don't want to preempt Tim's talk. I just want to say I wanted to emphasize that religion is at the center of the problem of open society and the problem of what kind of space we need in the 21st century to have a free debate that arrives at conclusions so we can all live together. And when I said I was looking for a long time to find the best person to do this discussion or lead us in this discussion, we got really lucky. Because Tim Crane, one of the great philosophers of the modern world, a man with an international reputation, the former Knightsbridge professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, a chair held by people I've revered like Bernard Williams and others, accepted CU's invitation to come here and join our faculty. So this is a double event. We're talking about an important subject in the history of open society, that is the place of religion. We've got the best person in the world to talk about it because he just has a new book out called oh my God, the name of the book, remind me.
The Meaning of Belief.
The Meaning of Belief, excuse me. That looks as if I haven't read it. I have read it. I just forgot the title, all right? Okay. He's been thinking about this issue. The book is just out, published by Harvard University Press, a small, marginal, struggling publishing company that you may have heard of, has published other books. And Tim is going to lead us in this discussion. So this is an opportunity to focus on religion in the open society, but is also a moment for our university to welcome a truly great philosopher to join our ranks, and I hope you will give him a very, very warm CEU welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very kind, embarrassing introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at CEU. It's a great pleasure to be giving this lecture in this series. As Michael said, the theme of this lecture series is to interrogate or rethink the notion of open society, and I am not going to really make much of an advance in rethinking that notion itself. I'm rather going to take for granted something which I think is part of the tradition of the idea of open society, that open societies and liberal societies have tended to have, in the post-Enlightenment era, a central place for religious tolerance and the tradition of religious tolerance. And as Michael said, the question, the problem of open society really emerged through the problem of religion in Western Europe. The tradition of religious tolerance that open societies, I think, and liberal societies have endorsed is an incredibly important part of the history of liberalism, but it's also a very important question for us today, as Michael indicated. But this raises the question of what tolerance is. What does it mean to be tolerant? What should we tolerate, and why? And I'm going to say some remarks about that this evening in the first part of my lecture. In the first part of my lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about religious tolerance and make a few comments about how tolerance should be understood. Then in the second part, I'm going to talk about, so to speak, the object of tolerance, what it is that's tolerated, religious belief itself, and I will open the angle of the lens, as it were, and say something more general and speculative about the nature of religious belief. And there I will be summarizing things that I've said in my forthcoming book, which I think comes out at the end of this month, The Meaning of Belief. So my first theme then is religious tolerance, and I think it's fair to say there's a widely agreed narrative about the emergence of religious tolerance as an ideal or as a human right in the West, in Europe and in America, as a result of the failure to impose religious conformity after the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. But that failure evolved into a success. That is to say, it evolved into a doctrine of religious tolerance as a positive value, even as a human right. And this is a very interesting transition, which, if there are any historians in the audience, they will know much more about this than I do. But if you look at the first edition of the Dictionary of the Académie Française, you will find that tolerance is defined as sufferance, forbearance that one has for what one cannot prevent. And there, tolerance is the admission of defeat. It's we tolerate faute de mieux. Why might one have to do this? Well, the answer was given by Locke, or one answer, part of the answer, was given by John Locke in a letter published a few years before this, the letter concerning toleration. And in that he argues, and I think this is absolutely correct, and the point remains absolutely relevant today, which is the state must tolerate different faiths because the state cannot constrain or compel belief. The state can constrain your action, it can control your behavior, but the state cannot control what you believe. And despite the difficulties in that idea, that is actually something which I think is central to the value of religious tolerance, which is the intrinsic value of freedom of thought. Locke said that in 1689. 100 years later, Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the French Revolution in 1789 says, "No one should be disturbed for his opinions, even in religion, provided that their manifestation does not trouble public order as established by law." So what had become an admission of defeat, that you could not get everyone to believe the same thing, has now been elevated into one of the rights of man. And we find it too in the very same year in the Bill of Rights of the United States. Right at the very beginning of the Bill of Rights, we have this claim that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And this became incorporated into the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So the historical situation is summed up very lucidly by Lynn Hunt in this sentence where she says that the Enlightenment of the 18th century played a major role in turning religious toleration, a grudging government policy, into freedom of religion, a human right. And I think it's a nice summary of the situation. Now the question for our time is that given that religious freedom, I think, is perceived to be a value by open societies and by the principles of open society, the question still is raised for secular societies, which I think, and certainly when we're talking about Western Europe, we're talking about secular societies. To what extent should religions be tolerated? It's one thing to say you have a value of freedom of religion, but that in saying that, you do not impose exact limits on what behaviour and what practices should be tolerated. There's also, of course, a question for religious societies, which I'm not going to address tonight at all, which is the extent to which religious societies themselves can tolerate secular views and other religions. But what I want to emphasize is that we need to start this thinking about this question having the right idea of tolerance in mind. And I think tolerance is something which is frequently misunderstood in recent public debates, in particular in debates to do with allowing a variety of different kinds of speech in public, in universities and public platforms and so on. The misunderstanding, I think, of tolerance is very easy to correct, but it's nonetheless very important. The misunderstanding, I think, is that tolerance has something to do with respect for opinions, or that to tolerate an opinion is to respect it. So that to have a doctrine of religious tolerance is to regard all religious views as worthy of respect or invulnerable to a certain kind of criticism. And that's what it is to be a tolerant person when it comes to religion. It's related to cliches like everyone is entitled to their opinion. It's also related to a sort of a popular and crude form of moral relativism that you sometimes find, that you're not entitled to criticize someone else because their values come from their own source and your values come from your source, and you're not in a position to criticize because you don't occupy a standpoint to evaluate these different values. Or that somehow another part of this collection of ideas is that it's in some way arrogant or conceited or perhaps imperialist or something like that to criticize other views in other cultures. And that a true doctrine of tolerance ought to be opposed to the critique of religion. And now this comes out most strongly in contemporary discussion, of course, in connection with the phenomenon of Islamophobia and the place of Islam in predominantly non-Islamic societies. And often the feelings that are brought out in those discussions are formulated in this way, that a truly tolerant society would not criticize, and that a truly tolerant society welcomes all views and does not judge among views, and that's what tolerance is. Now, I think this is a mistake, and it's a mistake about the very idea of tolerance. And it only takes a moment's thought to realize that tolerance does not imply respect for all views. If you think of a view that you particularly hold, that you think is very important, say for example, if you're in favor of gay marriage, or if you're in favor of the abolition of torture, then these aren't views that you tolerate. If you're in favor of gay marriage, you don't tolerate gay marriage. Toleration, rather, on the contrary, presupposes something that you disapprove of. So toleration, the very act of tolerating something, actually, as the Académie Française said, presupposes that you object to it in some way. I might tolerate my neighbour's loud music at New Year's Eve because I like my neighbour, I want to get on with them, even though I really object to this music. Maybe I think this music should never have been made. You know, it's an abomination of culture, and no one should be listening to this terrible stuff. But I tolerate it until 5 o'clock in the morning because I want to live in peace with my neighbours. I might tolerate their smelly food that they cook on their barbecue because they're my neighbours. They tolerate me. Maybe they tolerate my music. You know, so toleration implies disapproval. This is actually a point I picked up this point years ago from an essay by Bernard Williams, who Michael mentioned, who was one of my predecessors in Cambridge. And it's a simple point, but it's an important point. It's a profound one in relation to considering religious tolerance. Because what it means is that a doctrine of religious tolerance does not exclude critique, and it does not exclude disapproval, objection, or a generally negative attitude to some phenomena of the religions that you are tolerating. Now, some people call this a paradox of tolerance or toleration. I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's just a fact about what the attitude of toleration is. And I think it's the virtue of the attitude of toleration that it isn't a form of relativism. It's rather, it's a response to the things that you object to. Now, I think this could put this in a broader context. I think that tolerance isn't so much an attitude towards the truth of opinions, but it's an attitude towards the people who hold those opinions. So it's, as it were, it's a practical attitude rather than a theoretical attitude. Tolerance is not aiming at arriving at a true overall conception of all the things that you tolerate. What it is aiming to live in peace with the people whom you tolerate. And the same is true actually of the concept of respect. It's not true that toleration implies respect for all other views, or that you must respect other views. Some views are not worthy of respect. Some opinions you're not entitled to. Many of the opinions of people in the world they're not entitled to them. This is not something that follows from a principle of tolerance. What we respect and what we should respect is not views, but the people who hold the views. And when I say we respect the people who hold the views, I mean that in a rather abstract sense. I mean, you might think, so someone may hold a view which is objectionable, and that you think no one should really hold that view. The sense in which you respect them is that you acknowledge their autonomy as a human being. It's that very abstract sense of respecting someone. To respect them in that sense, you don't have to like them, you don't have to acknowledge that their views have any merit, but you acknowledge that they are a human being with the freedom of thought to think this. So I think insofar as tolerance involves respect, then it's only respect for people and not respect for opinions, and it's respect for people in this very abstract sense. It's the same idea that underlies our conviction that everyone, even those who have committed the most vile crimes, everyone is entitled to a fair trial, or everyone is equal before the law. It's that kind of abstract sense of respecting someone. Of course, then what this raises then is the question of what we should tolerate, because if we think that toleration implies that you object to something, then it should not follow from that we should tolerate everything we object to. All I'm saying is that the things that we should tolerate are, as a matter of fact, things that we object to. I'm not saying that everything that's objectionable should be tolerated. Obviously not. And this is where I can completely avoid the substantive question of what should be tolerated and what principles we should tolerate by appealing to the rule of law. And if in a state which has a rule of law of integrity, then all toleration must be constrained by that. So we don't have to tolerate people who are going to break the law, who do things that are against our moral, our legal codes. Tolerating people who do things that are against our moral code is another matter, and that's a complicated question, which I may come back to that. So I say toleration is necessarily constrained by the rule of law, and we shouldn't think of that as a surprising fact, or even something, or something that somehow deflates the idea of toleration, any more than we should think that free speech, the fact that free speech is constrained by the rule of law, is an objection to a sensible doctrine of freedom of speech. A sensible doctrine of freedom of speech should not allow people to broadcast constant obscenities in Vörösmarty tér in Budapest or anywhere in public, or to put up obscene pictures or in public, or offensive things that are universally considered to be offensive. That should not be consistent with, that should not be ruled out by a belief in freedom of speech. If someone thinks that freedom of speech should ideally imply the right to say anything, anywhere, at any time, then that's not a workable doctrine of freedom of speech, and it wouldn't be a real issue. The same is true actually of democracy, I think, but in the broad sense, analogously. We don't think a sensible doctrine of democracy should require that every vote of a democratically elected government should be validated by the citizens. And in my country, we've been suffering from that over-enthusiastic application of that idea in last year. So, tolerance implies objecting to something, doesn't mean everything that you object to is something you should tolerate. What and which things you should tolerate, how toleration should be constrained, is a matter for political and legal debate. So that's one domain or area where toleration needs to be seriously considered. But I want to focus on something different, which is one's personal attitude of tolerating religion in particular. I want to talk in the second part of my lecture about particularly the role of the intellectual in discussing these matters in open society. Because it seems to me that just because, again, I want to say, just because toleration should allow critique of religion, and it should be possible within a tolerant, liberal, open society to critique religion without thinking that this is in some way improper, inappropriate, or offensive, then that doesn't mean that any critique of religion is acceptable within an open society. So I want to say that from the point of view of an open society, there can be no objection to an atheist critique of religion, and I think that's a fairly obvious point. Critique as such is not incompatible with tolerance. So in the second part of my talk, I want to make some remarks about some recent critiques of religion by intellectuals in public life in Britain and the United States, although I know that their views have spread elsewhere too. The object of toleration, I said we're tolerating people, but let's abbreviate that to saying that we're tolerating religion. What are we tolerating when we tolerate religion? The one picture has been offered by the so-called new atheists. I'm sure that all of you in this room are familiar with people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, Grayling, the philosopher, Christopher Hitchens, the late journalist, and Sam Harris is also a journalist, who've written a number of polemical works attacking religion and from a moral and intellectual point of view. Their general outlook, I think, can be summed up in terms of two views. One is that religion is a combination of cosmology and morality. And by cosmology, I mean a theory of the universe. A theory of the universe rather in the same ballpark as cosmological physics is a theory of the universe, and morality in the sense of a code about how to behave. The second view is that religion is a bad thing that should be eliminated by rational argument and scientific evidence. I think all those people I just cited, and many, many more people in various humanistic groups in the UK that I've known and I've spoken in front of, believe those two things. Maybe slightly more subtle versions of them, but I think those are their two main doctrines. There's a view about what religion actually is, and there's a view about its merits. Here's just a couple of examples then of the sort of things that's said. Daniel Dennett, in his book Breaking the Spell, he said that religions are social systems whose participants avow belief in a supernatural agent or agents whose approval is to be sought. This seeking of approval is the role of morality in this picture. Among people who aren't actually new atheists in this sense, there's also Ronald Dworkin, who is actually sympathetic to religious belief, wrote a book a few years ago called Religion Without God. Ronald Dworkin was actually a frequent visitor to CEU, was a friend of CEU, and he describes the essence of religious belief as follows. He says, the conventional theistic religions with which most of us are most familiar, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, have two parts, a science part and a value part. And I think that's the sort of the simplest description of this outlook, that there's a science part to religion and there's a value part. The science part is a theory of the explanation of the world. The value part is the theory of how to live. Now, then the second main component of the new atheist view is that religion is a bad thing. Here's a splenetic quote from Christopher Hitchens when he said, religion poisons everything, as well as being a menace to civilization. It's become a threat to human survival. It's violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism, tribalism and bigotry, invested in ignorance and hostile to free inquiry, contemptuous of women and coercive towards children. It ought to have a great deal on its conscience, says Hitchens. Now, I think one very striking piece of fact about this recent public discussion is that neither side recognizes themselves in the other's description of them. It's a dialogue of the deaf in the sense that the new atheists accuse believers of mindless irrationality, and their religious critics say that the new atheists just miss the point. So what's really going on here? Well, I want to, in the few minutes that I have left, I want to make some very simple points about what seems to be missing from the new atheist picture of religious belief. And I think the first thing that's so obviously missing from what Dworkin calls the science plus value picture is when you ask, well, why do people go to church? Or why do people go to the mosque? Why do people go to the temple or the synagogue? What's that all about? And the short answer to this question, which is an idea that's been known for 100 years at least, was very nicely expressed by Durkheim in his Elementary Forms of Religious Life, when he said that a religion, I'm summarizing what he said here, that a religion is not just something you believe, but it's also something you belong to. That's left out of the cosmology plus morality picture. Cosmology is the theoretical explanation of how the world came into existence, and morality is telling you how to behave. And in nowhere in that do these people point out that actually religion involves belonging to a group. going to church, going to the synagogue, going to the mosque. But it's so obvious when you think about it that this is actually at the heart of the sort of capsule summaries of religion that you find, for example, in the 5 pillars of Islam. Those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Those are the 5 essential features of Islam, as I've sometimes said. Only one of them is a cosmological claim. The others are claims about what you should do. I mean, maybe giving alms, you can think of that as a kind of moral matter, but prayer, fasting, the pilgrimage, these are neither morality nor science, if you like. So. In my book, The Meaning of Belief, I draw a different picture from in a rather abstract way. I draw a different picture of the essence of religion. My alternative picture is based on the claim that religion involves 2 elements. What I call the religious impulse and identification. And I have a hypothesis about how we tie these two things together, which I'll try and explain to you now. What I call the religious impulse is rather nicely expressed in this remark of William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, when he said that religion was based on the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. The unseen order there is not the invisible, not invisible things in the sense that science discovers invisible things. It's rather the things that transcend this world, the world of experience. And I think that commitment to the transcendent, to what transcends everything we see around us and everything science finds out. That's expressed in, I think, a very widespread thought that there must be more to it than all this. There must be more to it than just this. Is this all there is? Surely this can't all be all there is. There must be something more to it than all this. And then people try and articulate that in great detail in the doctrines of religious belief. But I think the belief in the transcendent, the belief that there's something beyond this world, no matter how precisely or imprecisely you think of it, how metaphorically you think of it, or how literally you think of it, I think that is an essential component to anything that's properly called religion. Now, as I should say at this point, that both my conditions on religion I think they're neither necessary nor sufficient for something being religion. I'm not attempting to define religion in any strict sense. I agree with Nietzsche when Nietzsche said that nothing that has a history can ever be defined. And philosophers who spend their time thinking about logic and mathematics, subject matters which have no history, then have that paradigm of definition in mind, and sometimes that paradigm is very hard to apply to reality. So what I'm trying to persuade you of is that there are general features of what has counted as religion in human society, even if there are also things that people call religion which don't have those features. So I'm asking for your generosity and patience to go along with this idea for a while. So the religious impulse, I say, is a sense of the transcendent, it's a sense that there is something beyond. And I also want to say, and I try and justify this in the book, but I won't try and do this here, that the religious impulse is not anything like a scientific hypothesis. It's a claim about the world, but it's not a scientific theory. And when you realize that, it's not a scientific theory, and it's not incompatible with any scientific theory, then you can see how so much of the steam is going to go out of this debate. The apparent conflict will go out of the debate. One hopes, of course. You have to be optimistic. Identification is the second element of religion, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that a religion is something that you don't just believe, but you belong to. In here, my hero from the past is Durkheim, where Durkheim said that religious beliefs proper are always held by a defined collectivity that professes them and practices the rites that go with them. Now, that's the social element, the identification of people of your kind. It has many complex features, which of course is one of them is that there are people of your kind and then there are people who are not of your kind. And the world divides into two for many religious believers. And that can be one of the most difficult aspects to incorporate within something that could be called an open society. But I'm not going to say anything about that at the moment. I just want to ask you to agree with me that this is the other part of the essence of religion. The first part is the religious impulse. The second part is the identification with others in a group, in a tradition that in many cases will go back hundreds or thousands of years. And that involves saying the same things, participating in rituals, saying words that people have uttered for hundreds and hundreds of years, words perhaps that you don't fully understand, or that you don't understand literally, and that is not supposed to be a shortcoming of such a doctrine, but rather it's part of the essence of it, because the essence of it is that there's some mystery at the heart of the world. Now, I'm saying all this, I should say, I'm saying all this as an atheist. It seems to me, my own background was I was brought up a Catholic, but I'm an atheist. So I don't think I don't have a religious impulse. I don't think there's more to it than all this. But I'm trying to describe something from the outside that is, in one way or another, the commitment of about 80% of the human race. You might say, how can you generalize about 80% of the human race? I agree. It's, how can you do that? But what I say is that if people start talking about religion in general, in these general terms, then you can't escape that. The only way to escape it is to not talk about religion as such at all, and just say something much more specific. And then it won't be possible to engage with the others who talk about religion. So that's my excuse for operating at this stratospheric level of generality. Anyway, so I have these two claims about the essence of religion. One is the religious impulse, the other is identification. I say that, of course, it's possible that these can come apart, and these can come apart in actual religions. So I think there are religions that don't involve one of them. There may be the religions that aren't committed to the transcendent. And it's entirely conceivable, I think, that you could have someone who was some kind of solitary mystic who had a religious impulse but participated in no identification with others whatsoever. So of course these things can come apart both factually, empirically and conceptually. So is the connection between them, the question I want to ask, is the connection between them purely accidental or contingent? Or is there any explanation that we can give at the level of abstraction at which I'm talking of the connection between these things? So my final point tonight is that I think there is an explanation that you can give of how the religious impulse is connected with identification. And once again here I appeal to Durkheim. Durkheim actually defined religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. The idea of the sacred was central in his conception of what religion involves. And the sacred isn't the supernatural. It's not the same thing. It's not the magical as well, and Durkheim's very good on this, that a church of magic does not exist. The idea of the supernatural, which features prominently in the writings of Dawkins and Dennett and others, is not the central feature in terms of which we have to understand religion. The sacred is much more important. The division of the world into sacred things and profane things marks a distinction in what can be done, what sorts of things can be done to these objects. But an object of any sort can be a sacred thing. A text, a book, words, the actual words spoken which can be repeated again and again. An animal can be a sacred thing. A place could be a sacred thing. What's important is that when something is sacred, then it is not profane. And when something's profane, it's not sacred. The distinction is exclusive and exhaustive. When a sacred thing is defiled in some way, then this is profanity. This is making something profane. And this is why I think it's important then to emphasize that this idea of the sacred, it's not that the things have magical powers, or that believers who think that the Bible is a sacred text think that the Bible is in some way magic, that it could turn lead into gold or water into wine, something like this. Now, I want to link the element of identification with the religious impulse through the idea of the sacred. This is the claim of my book. Because I think that the sacred things, the objects and the books and the texts, the buildings, the places, have two features for believers. One is that they point outwards towards the transcendent, and I won't say what I mean by point outwards, but if anyone wants to discuss that, we can. What I mean is that they indicate something other than this world, that they're a sign or a symbol of something beyond this world. But simultaneously, the sacred objects, the sacred texts, bind people together and into their shared history. So it's because you've been saying the same words as these people that you go to church with, that people have been saying for hundreds of years in one form or another, that you belong to that group rather than another group. So groups are bound together by the things that they regard as sacred. And so because of this unites the two elements of what I'm calling religious belief. The sacred is both a manifestation of the transcendent in our world, and it's the unifying factor in religious identification. In that sense, Durkheim was right. So, what I want to say about the nature of religious belief, then, is that it's not that the things that people like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and those others say are completely wrong in describing the content of belief. It's rather this, that to understand a worldview, to understand a vision of the world, a philosophy, it's not enough just to list some of the things that the worldview says, some of the propositions that it contains. You also have to understand what's central and what's peripheral, what's at the core of the worldview, what's really making it move, and what is just extra stuff around the periphery. And what I've tried to do in my book, and what I've summarized here, is what I think of as the core of what counts as religious belief insofar as I understand that phenomenon, which is by appealing to the idea of the sacred, you can see how people are unified together around the same objects, which are involved in their rituals and their practices, while those objects themselves involve some kind of attempt to point beyond the empirical world towards a transcendent reality. And I think that's a very different picture from the picture that you get in Dawkins and Dennett, and I hope that it's a picture that might be recognizable to religious believers. So, let me sum up then what I've been trying to say. I think a secular, liberal, open society should tolerate religion, but this is not because all views have equal value. On the contrary, toleration presupposes that some views are objectionable. An open society, I think, should permit a critique of religion. Religion of all forms, and that is consistent with a proper doctrine of toleration, and it's consistent with a doctrine of respect for those people with whom you disagree. respect in the abstract sense I described earlier on. But a critique of religion, I think, should be based on an adequate conception of it. And this is why I say that this new atheist writing, the critique contained in those writings is wholly inadequate and fails to make sense of religious belief. Thank you very much.